Taiwanese Australians. Taiwanese Australians are Australian citizens or permanent residents who carry full or partial ancestry from the East Asian island country of Taiwan or from preceding Taiwanese regimes. Taiwanese people can be divided into two main ethnic groups: the Han Taiwanese, who have Han Chinese ancestry and constitute over 95% of the population, and the Taiwanese indigenous peoples, who have Austronesian ancestry and constitute approximately 2% of the population. The Han Taiwanese majority can be loosely subdivided into the Hoklo 70%, Hakka 14%, and Mainlanders post-1949 Chinese immigrants 14%. Historically, the first known Taiwanese people in Australia arrived from the Netherlands East Indies NEI Historical Indonesia during World War II 1939–1945, having been brought to the country by the exiled NEI government as civilian internees in 1942. At the time, Taiwan was part of the Empire of Japan, and subsequently, Taiwanese mass immigration to Australia began during the 1970s as a result of the complete dismantlement of the White Australia Policy 1901–1973, which historically prevented Taiwanese people and other non-Europeans from permanently settling in the country. History. Early history. Prior to 1942, it is unknown whether there were any Taiwanese people living in Australia. Internment of Japanese and Taiwanese people in Australia during WW2. Historically, Taiwanese Australians have had a significant presence in Tatra and Rushworth, two neighboring countryside towns respectively located in the regions of Greater Shepparton and Campaspe Victoria in the fertile Goulburn Valley. During World War II, ethnic Japanese from Australia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific and ethnic Taiwanese from the Netherlands East Indies were interned nearby to these towns as a result of anti-espionage/collaboration policies enforced by the Australian government and W. Roughly 600 Taiwanese civilians' entire families, including mothers, children, and the elderly, were held at Internment Camp No. 4, located in Rushworth but nominally labeled as being part of the Tatra internment group between January 1942 and March 1946. Most of the Japanese and Taiwanese civilians were innocent and had been arrested for racist reasons. See the related article Internment of Japanese Americans, an article detailing similar internment in America. Several Japanese and Taiwanese people were born in the internment camp and received British-Australian birth certificates from a nearby hospital. Several Japanese people who were born in the internment camp were named Tatra in honor of their families' wartime internment at Tatra. During wartime internment, many working-age adults in the internment camp operated small businesses, including a sewing factory and local schools within the internment camp. Regarding languages, schools mainly taught English, Japanese, Mandarin, and Taiwanese languages Hokkien, Hakka, Formosan. Filipinos are purported to have also been held at the camp, alongside Koreans, Manchus possibly from Manchukuo, New Caledonians, New Hebrideans, people from the South Seas Mandate, people from Western New Guinea and presumably also Papua New Guinea, and Aboriginal Australians who were mixed Japanese. After the war, internees were resettled in their country of ethnic origin, rather than their country of nationality or residence, with the exception of Japanese Australians, who were generally allowed to remain in Australia. Non-Australian Japanese, who originated from Southeast Asia and the Pacific, were repatriated to occupied Japan. On the other hand, Taiwanese, most of whom originated from the Netherlands East Indies, were repatriated to occupied Taiwan. The repatriation of Taiwanese during March 1946 caused public outcry in Australia due to the allegedly poor living conditions aboard the repatriating ship Yoizuki in what became known as the Yoizuki Hellship scandal. Post-WW2, the Australian government was eager to expel any Japanese internees who did not possess Australian citizenship, and this included the majority of Taiwanese internees as well. However, The Republic of China ROC was an ally of Australia, and since the ROC had occupied Taiwan during October 1945, many among the Australian public believed that the Taiwanese internees should be deemed citizens of the ROC, and therefore friends of Australia, not to be expelled from the country, or at least not. This debate concerning the citizenship of Taiwanese internees, whether they were Chinese or Japanese, further inflamed public outrage at their allegedly appalling treatment by the Australian government. Additionally, it was technically true that several camp babies, internees who had been born on Australian soil whilst their parents were interned, possessed Australian birth certificates, which made them legally British subjects. However, many of these camp babies were also deported from the country alongside their non-citizen parents. There was also a minor controversy regarding the destination of repatriation, with some of the less Japan-friendly Taiwanese. On January 5, 1993, a plaque was erected at the site of the internment camp at Tatra, Rushworth, to commemorate the memory of wartime internment. 46 Japanese and Taiwanese ex-internees, as well as a former Australian camp guard, are listed on the plaque. History from the 1970s and onward. Starting from 1976, Australia began to consider the Taiwanese to be nationals of the ROC Taiwan, making a distinction between them and the mainland Chinese living in the PRC, but considering both people groups to be ethnic Chinese. The White Australia policy had been completely abolished by 1973, and so Taiwanese and mainland Chinese immigration to Australia had been gradually increasing since then. The Australian government specifically targeted Taiwanese nationals for immigration during the 1980s. Simultaneously, there was an influx of mainland Chinese immigration to Australia during the 1980s due to the PRC relaxing its immigration policies. The majority of Taiwanese immigrants to Australia during the 1970s and onward were highly skilled white-collar workers. The current total population of Taiwanese Australians is unknown, with only first-generation and second-generation Taiwanese being counted in the Australian census as Taiwanese, and with third-generation Taiwanese or older families being counted as just Australian. The current number of first/second-generation Taiwanese Australians is roughly 45,000–55,000 people. It is estimated that roughly 90% of Taiwanese Australians are first/second-generation Australians. Culture. Language. In Australia, Australian English is the de facto national language, and most immigrants to Australia are expected to be proficient in the language. Unlike in the United States, for example, there aren't many large non-Anglophone ethnic enclaves in Australia, since Australian history has been heavily dominated by British colonialism. Multiculturalism in Australia is a fairly recent phenomenon that was intentionally encouraged by successive Australian governments as part of the country's rapidly changing foreign policy and ethnic policy following the 10. Taiwanese immigrants to Australia can usually speak their native Taiwanese languages, including Taiwanese Mandarin, Taiwanese Hokkien, Taiwanese Hakka, and various other Taiwanese languages, such as the Taiwanese indigenous languages. However, proficiency in these languages typically already drops by the second generation, i.e. the first generation born in Australia. Depending on which social class and or ethnic group the Taiwanese immigrant parents originate from, their children may only remain proficient in one of these languages. Typically, proficiency in Mandarin is usually retained by the second generation, whereas proficiency in Hokkien and Hakka drops significantly unless the parents place a particular emphasis on retaining proficiency in these languages. Internationally and in Australia, Mandarin is far more useful for traveling and business than other Taiwanese languages, which may result in parents prioritizing Mandarin. By the third and fourth generations, proficiency in even Mandarin is usually lost entirely unless the family has been residing in a Chinese or Taiwanese ethnic enclave in Australia for several decades. Such enclaves do exist, and they are usually known as Chinatowns. Chinese enclaves in Australia are quite large and numerous, but Taiwanese enclaves aren't. According to the 2016 Australian census, approximately 90% of Taiwanese immigrants to Australia, including those who have come to Australia during preceding decades, speak Mandarin as their primary non-English language at home, whereas approximately 2% speak Hokkien. Approximately 66% of those who speak a language other than English at home also speak English, i.e., they speak multiple languages. Approximately 5% speak only or primarily English at home. Settlement. The Taiwanese community in Australia is relatively minor and is often not distinguished from the Chinese community in Australia. Brisbane QLD hosts the largest Taiwanese community in Australia. Sydney NSW and Melbourne VIC also host significant Taiwanese communities. Typically, Taiwanese people immigrating to Australia prefer to settle in major cities.